Yesterday, the Premier announced that he's scrapping the Sask Party carbon tax, otherwise known as LBS. Mr. Speaker, fine. It's been nothing but a slush fund for this government anyways.
That's right.
But here's a question for the Premier. What's the plan for the nearly $500 million hole that he's just blown in the budget that we're supposed to be voting off just today?
I recognize the Premier.
The impact on the budget will be immaterial. The material impact will be on Saskatchewan families, Mr.
Speaker. Here.
Because the plan moving forward is to reduce the power bill of each and every Saskatchewan family, Mr. Speaker. A power bill today that has over 10% of that bill is carbon tax, increasing to over 25%, Mr. Speaker. And our ask is for all of those folks that are running in the national election to be very clear with Saskatchewan people on their intent when it comes to the heavy emitter carbon tax, which is the quiet carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. It's a quiet carbon tax that few see, with the exception of our Saskatchewan power bill here in this province, Mr. Speaker. But it's the quiet carbon tax that each and every one of us as Canadians and Canadian families pay when we go to the filling station, when we go to the grocery store, and everything that we buy, Mr. Speaker. So the plan that is very material to Saskatchewan families is to scrap the Liberal NDP carbon tax in this province, the visible one and the quiet one, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask the NDP why they haven't always supported that, Mr. Speaker, why it took Donald Trump getting elected in the USA for them to find their moral high ground to try to get a few votes in this province.
The leader of the opposition.
Their carbon tax, and this is why this budget is not worth the paper that it's written on. Mr. Speaker, it ignores what happened this week with Russian potash. It's silent on the realities that are already facing people in this province when it comes to tariffs. And now the Premier has blown a nearly $500 million hole in the budget by scrapping his carbon tax. Now, there are other ways that we can reduce emissions and we can drive innovation. But this Premier today owes the people of this province an answer before we vote off this budget. How big is the deficit now, Mr. Premier, that he's blown a $500 million hole in this budget?
I recognize the Premier.
Time and time again on the floor of this Assembly and the Rotunda, Mr. Speaker's comments is talk from the opposition versus action from the government. Mr. Speaker, on April 1st, it'll be 6 years since this carbon tax was imposed on Canadians, including those in Saskatchewan. There were seven provinces, Mr. Speaker, that opposed that, took it to the Supreme Court of Canada, and one opposition party, Mr. Speaker, not this opposition party, of course. At that point in time, what they said about us taking that harmful tax on Saskatchewan residents to the Supreme Court of Canada was, that's a pointless crusade, Mr. Speaker. You should not be doing that because they support the carbon tax, and they still do today, and you can tell by their reactions, Mr. Speaker. You're either in or in the way when it comes to supporting Saskatchewan families and not paying the quiet carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, moving forward. And we would ask the federal leaders, all of them, Jagmeet Singh, Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney, to be very clear with Canadian and Saskatchewan families and voters on where are you when it comes to increasing the quiet carbon tax on Canadian families, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan people are worth a real answer, and Saskatchewan people deserve a real budget that addresses the real challenges that we're facing today, not a make-believe fairy tale. Mr. Speaker, this budget has no contingency for tariffs and no plan for the future, and Saskatchewan people, frankly, deserve better. Why won't the Premier scrap his bogus budget today, and why won't he come back with some real answers and a real budget for the people of this province?
I recognize the Premier.
Got a budget, Mr. Speaker. It's a balanced budget, and we're going to get the opportunity to vote on it in a few minutes. What we have seen is talk from the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. They have been trying to...
Okay, I just would ask, it's the last day of the week. Let's do our best to hear. We're going to do our best to ask questions, give answers, and listen very carefully. So I will expect, and I'm going to call it tight, so let's Premier, let's hear what you have to say.
Mr. Speaker, all week we've seen talk from opposition members in an attempt to shred the Saskatchewan budget, and all that has been shredded is the NDP credibility in this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the NDP, Mr. Speaker, across this Canada have delivered budgets that are not balanced, Mr. Speaker. In fact, there is not one other balanced budget in the nation of Canada that has been introduced today, Mr. Speaker. We go to NDP British Columbia, Mr. Speaker, almost an $11 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker, versus a surplus in the province of Saskatchewan. We go to NDP Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, depending on which line item or budget you read, it's either $800 million or $1.8 billion, Mr. Speaker, compared to a balanced budget in Saskatchewan. That's a province that receives $4.7 billion in equalization versus zero in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan people, Saskatchewan industries, Mr. Speaker, are looking forward to the future in what was a very challenging time. We're asking federal leaders to join with provincial leaders in providing hope and making life more affordable for Saskatchewan families. The NDP need to get on board.
I recognize the member from Regina South Alberta.
Why, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, for years, the Saskatchewan Party government has had their carbon tax cake while eating it too. They've complained about having their very own Sask Party carbon tax while they've poured Sask Party carbon tax dollars into their OBPS slush fund. And years ago, Mr. Speaker, we asked the government to put those dollars to work, building out renewable power, power bill relief, literally anything, Mr. Speaker. But meanwhile, they've sat on those dollars, hoarding them like Scrooge McDuck. So, Mr. Speaker, what is the Sask Party's plan for those carbon tax dollars they've taken from Saskatchewan people?
I recognize the Premier.
The reason there is even a carbon tax present in Saskatchewan, and we took it to the Supreme Court of Canada, is because of the Liberal and NDP governments in this nation, supported by the members opposite at the time, Mr. Speaker, where they called our court case a pointless crusade, Mr. Speaker. They called our court case a pointless crusade, Mr. Speaker, and very much were supportive of imposing these unnecessary inflationary costs on Saskatchewan families. With respect to the support that we put forward with IBEW, whether it be training programs, people that are working in the power generation industry in Saskatchewan, hardworking people in Estevan and Coronach and many other communities, Mr. Speaker. Just a few minutes ago, the International Vice President of IBEW, Russ Suchuk, said this, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "Very pleased to applaud Premier Scott Moe's leadership in announcing that Saskatchewan is carbon tax free. This will go. This will go a long way to help secure Saskatchewan's energy independence and expansion. Further, this will require increasing numbers of highly skilled tradespeople, and IBEW is proud of its partnership with Premier Moe to train more and more IBEW skilled workers. There is no doubt Premier Moe is building up the province and supporting the families and communities of the great province of Saskatchewan." Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member from Regina South Alberta.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it truly is a great day in Saskatchewan. But, Mr. Speaker, those Sask Party carbon tax dollars have been paid by Saskatchewan people and Saskatchewan industry, and they deserve a real answer. They need to know what those dollars are going to be used for. The Sask Party government has shown through their actions, Mr. Speaker, that they can't manage their way out of a wet paper bag, and they sure as sin can't manage anything approaching a major project. Saskatchewan people have zero faith that these dollars won't be wasted and squandered on the next bypass or GTH. Everything this government touches has turned into a political fiasco. So again, Mr. Speaker, what are those Sask Party carbon tax dollars that the Sask Party government confiscated from the people of this province going to be used for?
I recognize the Premier.
Speaker, at the time that we took that court case to the Supreme Court of Canada, there were 7 provinces and 1 opposition party that supported and intervened in that case. Why did the NDP in Saskatchewan, an opposition at the party at the time, why did you not intervene in that case? Why did you call taking that case on behalf of Saskatchewan residents a pointless crusade? Why did you support that Liberal NDP carbon tax and continue to support it up until there's a new president and a reason to change your mind, Mr. Speaker? Why are you offside not only with the IEBW leadership and workers across this province? Why are you offside with SARM, with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, the Saskatchewan Realtors Association, the potash companies, the energy companies, Mr. Speaker? There's some serious reflection that needs to happen, Mr. Speaker, and the members opposite with the talk that they put out on the floor of this Assembly, Mr. Speaker. We're very confident in the actions of the Saskatchewan government on behalf of Saskatchewan families that are going to have a more affordable lifestyle, Mr. Speaker, because of the decisions that are being made here today.
Mr. Speaker, maybe the Premier missed it while he was applauding himself. We think this is great news for Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, but a question for that Premier. His Sask Party carbon tax dollars, that money, Mr. Speaker, gets washed through Sask Power in a grant for operations. If Sask Power isn't getting this government's clean electricity grant anymore, Mr. Speaker, the company is going to have to get those dollars from somewhere else. That's just a fact. And you know what they say, Mr. Speaker, there's only one taxpayer. So, Mr. Speaker, to this government, how many Sask Power rate hikes are going to be needed to make up for the lost Sask Party carbon tax revenue?
Before we hear the answer, I'm going to caution the member, talking about washing funds, slush funds, both sides. During one of the member statements saying that the NDP say this, they don't, support these people. We're going back and forth. There's good questions, good answers. We have students here listening today. How do we expect their classrooms will function when our people can't sit and hear? So I would ask, I'll give a little extra time to the NDP at the end if there's shortage, because I've spoken a little longer. But please, let's have questions and answers, and keep your words very parliamentarian, I would request. Thanks. Premier. I recognize the Premier.
It's going to be difficult for some political parties to understand, Mr. Speaker, but when you regulate and tax an industry less, their cost of operation goes down. Thus, Saskatchewan families pay less for their power. Thus, Saskatchewan industries pay less for their power. Thus, we have the opportunity to protect jobs that are here, Mr. Speaker, and we have the opportunity to attract additional investment that is going to create additional jobs, like the Cargill plant right here in Regina, Mr. Speaker, BHP, we have Foran Mining, we have NextGen Energy, we have One Sky Forest Products, Mr. Speaker, all investing in the province because of the very solid regulatory environment we have. So the answer is less than they would with the carbon tax in place that's supported by NDP and Liberal governments, Mr. Speaker, and herein lies the difference between the parties on the floor of this Assembly, Mr. Speaker. We have action by the government, action being taken on every front to support the affordability matrix of families in this province and have a more affordable environment in a very uncertain time, versus talk from the members opposite, Mr. Speaker, which goes to the history of the NDP party, the NDP opposition party in Saskatchewan. First, when they look at an industry, Mr. Speaker, they find a way to regulate it, like the carbon tax. Then second, they find a way to tax it, like the 9% PST that we had in this province under the NDP. And when all of that fails, Mr. Speaker, and the industry survives and is still breathing, they nationalize it, Mr. Speaker. They've done it before. They mused about it this week. I think one of the members even said, with respect to nationalizing the potash industry in this province, it was the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker. They still believe that. Hear, hear.
I recognize the member from Regina, South Albert.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let's return to reality. We're talking about his government's carbon tax that he slapped people and industries in Saskatchewan with 2.5 years ago. And That's Mr. Right. Speaker, the Premier might not like the question, but people deserve an answer. Affordability, cost of living, those are the major concerns for people here in the province. So again, Mr. Speaker, how much higher will Sask Power rates be in 2028 to make up for his Sask Party carbon tax lost revenue? Are they going to be 10% higher, 25% higher, 50% higher, Mr. Speaker? What's that number?
I recognize the Premier.
It would stand to reason, Mr. Speaker, and again, if your goal is to regulate it, tax it, and nationalize it, you wouldn't understand this, Mr. Speaker. But when you tax and regulate an industry, at a lower rate, Mr. Speaker, their cost of business is less. So it would stand to reason that if you remove the carbon tax from the power generation industry, Saskatchewan families will pay less for their power rate, starting with 10% on April the 1st, Mr. Speaker. That's action taken by this government, Mr. Speaker. 10% lower power rates. What we are asking the federal leaders in the national election to do, whether it be NDP, Conservative or Liberal, is to be very clear with Canadians on what your plan is for the quiet carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. Be very clear on what your plan is for that quiet carbon tax. Will you allow provinces to regulate in this space? Will you set it to zero? Will you freeze it where it is, or will you increase it exponentially over time, Mr. Speaker? Because if you increase it exponentially over time, that 10% charge on power bills will go to 25 and 50, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are not in support of that. We want the federal leaders to be clear with Canadians and clear with Saskatchewan families, Mr. Speaker, and we want this ridiculous inflationary tax that's been supported time and time again by the members opposite on the floor of this Assembly gone.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear on this side of the House that we don't support the carbon tax just because they're not listening. Mr. Speaker, more than half of Saskatchewan's healthcare equipment and services are being sourced from companies based in the United States. Yes, the United States, where President Trump threatens daily to devastate our economy and threatens the very existence of our country. Why does the Minister of Health continue to bankroll American companies when this Sask Party government promised to buy Canadian?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear that on this side of the House, our #1 priority of the Ministry of Health, and as well with the Saskatchewan Health Authority, is providing timely access for patients to the care when they need it and where they need it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, of course, we're taking this opportunity to review our procurement within 3S Health, as well with our national procurement organization, HealthPro. Where there's opportunities to move procurement to Canadian companies, we will absolutely look at that, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, let's bring this back to something that we've talked about on the floor a bunch this week: women's health, breast health. The mammography machines at the New Regina Breast Health Centre are manufactured by GE, an American company. Is that member opposite saying that we shouldn't buy that equipment to make sure that we can open up that breast health centre and provide that access to care for women in the southern half of the province, Mr. Speaker? We're not going to sacrifice patient care.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
It's a ridiculous accusation from that minister, Mr. Speaker. Another round of tariffs has been promised by Trump on April 2nd, which he is calling Liberation Day, but it actually means more pain and suffering in Saskatchewan. We don't know what Trump will throw at us, and our reliance on American suppliers is frankly dangerous. Why is this minister risking supply chain disruptions for critical medical supplies?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, this is another important example of how integrated supply chains are across the world, which is exactly why our Premier, why our Ministers of Trade and Export Development and other ministers have been engaging with leaders in the United States of America as well as countries around the world, Mr. Speaker. We believe in a tariff-free environment, Mr. Speaker. We want to see these important goods flow back and forth across our borders. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear again. We are not going to sacrifice patient care in this province. We're going to make sure that the mammography machines that are manufactured by an American company are here and ready to roll when that breast health centre opens up later in April. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Saskatchewan Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about nearly $123 million worth of critical medical supplies and healthcare services coming from the United States. And we are in a trade war with the United States that has been threatened for months, and now there's no end in sight. Why did the minister sit on his hands for months instead of taking action to protect Saskatchewan healthcare?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to try and be very clear for the members opposite. What's in that nearly $123 million? Mr. Speaker, mammography machines. Important drugs that are part of the Saskatchewan formulary that Saskatchewan people depend on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government is not going to put politics ahead of people and the patient care in this province, Mr. Speaker, like the members opposite. We are going to look at our procurement options, absolutely, Mr. Speaker, but our priority is patient care.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
I don't think that we're being fair with either side. We're putting words in one another's mouths that really aren't there, and so I'd ask the member to be cautious in our responses and cautious in our questions, please. I recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On one hand, we've got Chinese tariffs on canola, Putin's products flooding world markets while he continues to kill Ukrainians, and an impending Liberation Day in the U.S. on Tuesday, which means more tariffs and more pain here in Saskatchewan. And then we've got the Sask Party budget that isn't worth the paper it's written on. It must be a record, even for this government, that their already problematic projections didn't even last a week. No plan for tariffs, no plan for jobs, no plan, period. Will someone and anyone on that side of the House stand up and explain to the people of Saskatchewan how they got it so wrong at such a critical time?
I recognize the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, we're living in uncertain geopolitical times, Mr. Speaker, but we have tabled in this House, and we will vote on it later today, likely the only balanced budget in the country. Mr. Speaker, the challenges that the member opposite's referring to, the best way to meet those challenges is from a position of fiscal strength, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we're doing. The members opposite have been claiming they've been asking for affordability measures, Mr. Speaker. They've been asking for support for industry in the face of all these tariffs, Mr. Speaker. That's what the announcement on carbon tax did today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For months, this Premier refused to speak out against Donald Trump while he threatened our country's very existence. He told reporters over and over again that we can't take Trump's threats literally. Well, the newsflash for the Premier is Donald Trump literally has a job-killing tariff on Saskatchewan steel right now. Donald Trump is literally threatening more tariffs next week, and Donald Trump has literally cut a deal with the murderer of Vladimir Putin that could cause major harm to our economy. Given all this, will the Premier stand now and apologize to the people of Saskatchewan for sitting on his hands while Donald Trump did everything he could to ruin our economy, literally?
I recognize the Minister of Trade and Export.
Mr. Speaker, we're extremely disappointed, actually quite disturbed by the comments of the U.S. administration. You know, these tariffs, the actions that the U.S. has done to support Russia's, I guess, entrance back into the world market for ag products, fertilizer exports, these are certainly concerns to us as government. These are the reasons why that our Premier continues to engage at that national and international level with the U.S. government, certainly with major players in the U.S. government. These are the reasons why we continue to need to engage at this level all members of this caucus, of this government, are going to be engaging on a regular basis with the U.S. government to ensure that the needs, the wants, the desires of our stakeholders here in Saskatchewan are understood by the U.S. administration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Westview.
In Saskatoon, nearly 500 people have overdosed on toxic drugs in March, and the month isn't even up yet. Already we've lost 9 lives just in my city, just this month. When we asked yesterday, the minister said, and I quote, "We will continue to do that work," end quote. That work has cost 9 people their lives this month, just in Saskatoon. Will the minister admit she needs to do more to stop overdoses in this province?
Sure.
I recognize the Minister of Remote and Rural Health.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, any death from an overdose is a tragedy, and we recognize that, and we do recognize what is happening in the community of Saskatoon. As I spoke to yesterday, we have been working with the City of Saskatoon, the first responder, various community-based organizations. We have set up a provincial emergency operations centre, Mr. Speaker, but the root of the problem here really is the drugs that are out there on the streets, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask the members opposite, the MLA for Saskatoon-Nutana has said that illicit drugs are necessary to legalize, pointing to British Columbia as an example we should follow. She said that here in this House. Those are her words, Mr. Speaker. British Columbia has since backtracked and decriminalized the decriminalization because it has only made the illicit drug use worse. Does the NDP believe that decriminalizing illicit drugs and unleashing that crime will be good for the City of Saskatoon?
To be clear on the extra time that I had mentioned to add on, I was if we would have ended a question at a period of 10 seconds, I would have added, but because I spoke for about 30 seconds. So